The sound of thunder. The sky over northern France was the color of gunmetal. Low clouds pressed against the horizon, and the wind carried the faint scent of oil and ozone, the perfume of war. Beneath those churning clouds, in the early spring of 1944, the rumble of engines began to rise, not yet a roar, but a low growl rolling across the English countryside. The ground crews at RAF Kingsnorth looked up as the sound thickened, an approaching storm of radial engines. Alive with power, they called her the Jug. Not because she was graceful, she wasn't. She was big, fat, loud, and ungainly. But she was about to change the course of the air war, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine spinning a propeller wider than a man's height was one of the largest single-seat fighters the Allies had ever built. To German pilots, it looked more like a flying beer keg than a dogfighter. They laughed when they first saw it. They shouldn't have. The pilots who strapped into the P-47 were different. Many were kids barely out of high school, Americans with nervous grins, chewing gum, and photographs of girls folded neatly into their flight suits. Their aircraft bore painted names in cursive script: Hot Rod Honey, Kansas City Kitty, the Reamer. Each nose told a story, a bit of home, a piece of swagger, a touch of fear. As dawn burned through the fog, the Thunderbolts lined up for takeoff. The mission board was simple. Escort the bombers to the heart of Germany. Protect them from the Luftwaffe. Bring them home. But that morning, the Luftwaffe was waiting. The air over occupied Europe was a graveyard of ambitions. For years, the German pilots of the Jagdwaffe, the fighter arm, had reigned supreme. They were knights of the sky, veterans of Poland, France, and the early days over England. Men like Adolf Galland and Günter Rall, legends with hundreds of kills, trained in a doctrine that saw air combat as both science and art. They flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and later the Focke-Wulf FW 190, sleek predators that sliced through the air with deadly precision. Against the early Allied bombers and fighters, they'd been nearly untouchable. But by 1943, the tide was turning. Slowly, inexorably. The American 8th Air Force had begun pounding Germany day after day. Factories in Schweinfurt, ball-bearing plants in Regensburg, oil refineries, rail hubs, and airfields. Each one was a target. But there was a problem. The bombers were dying faster than they could be replaced. In the early raids, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators went in without long-range fighter cover. Once they crossed the line of friendly territory, they were alone, and the Luftwaffe feasted. Entire formations disappeared into black smoke and twisted aluminum. The American losses were unsustainable. The air war could not be won at that cost. The Allies needed a guardian. They needed a fighter that could go the distance, something tough enough to slug it out with the best the Luftwaffe had, and still bring its pilot home. That's where the P-47 entered the story. At first glance, the Thunderbolt looked like a mistake. It weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded, heavier than a German twin-engine bomber. Its fuselage was built around that enormous engine, its wings wide and thick, its cockpit high, giving the pilot a panoramic view. On the ground, mechanics joked that it took a runway and a prayer to get it airborne, but once in the air, once that giant engine came alive and the turbocharger kicked in, the P-47 became something else entirely. It climbed like a homesick angel, dove like a meteor, and could take a beating that would shred other aircraft to ribbons. And then there were the guns. 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, capable of spitting out a combined rate of nearly 7,200 rounds per minute. Each gun fired bullets as long as a man's hand, slugs of lead and fire that could tear a plane apart or scythe through a column of trucks on the ground. It wasn't elegant. It was brutal efficiency in aluminum form. And in war, brutality wins. On April 5, 1943, a group of young pilots from the 56th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, took their P-47s into combat for the first time. They didn't yet know it, but they were about to forge one of the most fearsome reputations in the air. Zemke was a Montana-born pilot, calm under pressure, with an instinct for both leadership and danger. He'd studied Luftwaffe tactics before the war, and he knew the Germans' strengths, discipline, altitude advantage, and deadly gunnery. His answer was aggression, controlled chaos. He trained his men to attack in coordinated flights, to use the Thunderbolt's speed and toughness to their advantage. The early missions were rocky. The P-47's range was short, too short. It couldn't yet reach deep into Germany, so the pilots often escorted bombers only part way, watching them disappear into the grey distance, helpless as the Luftwaffe tore into them beyond range. The radio would fill with cries for help they couldn't answer. That haunted them, but each sortie taught them something new. They learned how to climb higher, faster. They learned how to dive from the sun, hit and run. And they learned that when things got ugly, the Jug could take punishment that would kill anything else in the sky. Imagine this. You're 20 years old, hands sweating inside your gloves. You're sitting in a metal cocoon 25,000 feet above the English Channel. Your engine howls like a pack of wolves. Your oxygen mask smells of rubber and fear, and your world is a bubble of sky and death. Ahead, a formation of silver bombers glints in the sunlight, crawling toward the Reich. Below them, waiting, are the best German pilots alive, and suddenly, there they are. Black specks against the blue. The Luftwaffe comes screaming down, cannon shells streaking through the formation. Bombers erupt into flames. Parachutes bloom like deadly flowers. You pull the stick, roll inverted, and dive to intercept. The P-47's engine roars, the G-forces crush your chest, and you spot the enemy. An FW-190, sleek and deadly. He sees you too. For a second, it's a dance of death. You pull the trigger, and your 8 Brownings come alive. The recoil shakes the wings, tracers streak across the sky, and the German fighter explodes in a flash of orange fire. For a heartbeat, you're not afraid. You're alive in a way that defies reason. Then the radio crackles, and now another bomber's gone. And you remember this isn't about glory. It's survival. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe was still confident, even contemptuous. German pilots had a nickname for the new American fighter, Der Fliegende Backstein, the flying brick. They mocked its bulk and its sluggish turns, believing no aircraft that big could ever match them in agility or kill count. To them, it was another Allied curiosity. Like the slow British bombers they'd shot down by the hundreds. They didn't realize the storm was coming. The P-47 was evolving fast. New drop tanks extended its range, new tactics made it deadlier, and its pilots were learning to fight like wolves, hitting hard, disappearing, then returning to strike again. The Germans still had the edge in experience, but that edge was wearing thin. The Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots it couldn't replace. Each time a German ace fell, he took years of training and irreplaceable knowledge with him. The Americans, on the other hand, were learning faster than anyone expected. The sheer scale of their air operations meant that every mistake was analyzed, corrected, and transmitted across the entire Air Force in weeks. It was evolution by fire, and the P-47 was the perfect survivor. One pilot, Francis Gabi Gabreski, became the embodiment of that transformation. The son of Polish immigrants, Gabreski was brash, restless, and absolutely fearless. He learned the Luftwaffe's psychology by studying their habits, how they approached, when they hesitated, how they tried to draw their opponents into turning fights. Gabreski refused to play their game. He used the Thunderbolt's dive speed and firepower to devastating effect. His favorite move was to climb above a German formation, pick his target, and drop like a thunderbolt, firing short. Controlled bursts that tore wings apart before the enemy could even react. Soon, German radio chatter began to change. They no longer laughed when they saw the big American fighter. They cursed. They ran. The transformation was visible even on the ground. At air bases across England, Thunderbolts began to fill the sky with their trademark roar. Civilians would look up and feel the air tremble as entire squadrons thundered overhead. Mechanics worked around the clock, cursing the size of the engine but marveling at how it refused to die. Pilots who limped home with holes in their wings or oil leaking from bullet-riddled cowlings would climb out grinning, slap the fuselage and mutter, "Good girl." You got me home. They trusted their planes like brothers. And in war, that bond was everything. Still, the Luftwaffe wasn't beaten yet. In the spring of 1944, they launched counterattacks with renewed fury. New models of the Fu-190 and Bf-109 appeared, faster, better armed, and deadly in expert hands. In the skies above Berlin, Leipzig, and Bremen, the air turned into a storm of metal. Each mission was a gamble. Each victory came at a cost. Every time a Thunderbolt went down, the others felt it like a punch to the heart. The Allied commanders knew the Thunderbolt's days as a bomber escort were numbered. The new P-51 Mustang was arriving, longer range, sleeker, deadlier at altitude. But the P-47 wasn't done. It was about to find its true calling, not just as a fighter, but as a ground attack beast unlike anything the Germans had faced. Soon, those same German pilots who once laughed at the flying brick would look down in terror as the Jug descended upon their convoys, spewing fire and destruction across roads, railways, and tanks. But that reckoning, that moment when laughter turned to fear, was still ahead. For now, in the grey light of early morning, the Thunderbolts took off again, wheels lifting from English soil, climbing into the clouds toward occupied Europe. The radios crackled, engines screamed, and the horizon burned with the rising sun. A storm was gathering, a storm of steel, courage, and thunder. And somewhere beyond that horizon, German pilots were already climbing to meet it, confident that their skill would prevail, unaware that the very sound rising from the west, that deep, rhythmic growl of the P-47, would soon echo as the death knell of the Luftwaffe. The laughter wouldn't last much longer. The gathering storm it began with confidence, and confidence in war can be a dangerous thing. By the winter of 1943, the war in Europe had entered a brutal rhythm. The Allies were winning on the ground in Italy, inching their way up the peninsula. In the east, the Red Army was pushing the Wehrmacht backward, inch by bloody inch. Yet above the clouds, high in the cold blue, a different kind of battle was unfolding. The Allied air war was meant to break Germany before the invasion of Europe even began. The bomber will always get through, British strategists had once said, echoing the interwar faith in air power as the weapon of destiny. The Americans took that theory and turned it into a crusade. The 8th Air Force's goal was clear: obliterate the German industrial heart. Factories, oil plants, rail hubs, the sinews of the Nazi war machine. If the sky could be conquered, the ground would follow. But by late 1943, the losses told a grim story. Bombers were being chewed apart by fighters before they reached their targets. Missions to Regensburg and Schweinfurt had become synonymous with disaster. Dozens of B-17s lost in a single day. Thousands of airmen vanishing in smoke and flame. The numbers didn't lie. Unescorted bombers were not winning the war. And in the quiet rooms of command, even the most iron-willed officers began to wonder if the dream of daylight precision bombing might die over the grey fields of Germany. Inside a drafty command building in England, the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke hung in the air. On one wall, a massive map of Europe was marked with coloured pins. Blue for the Allies, red for the Reich. And across the centre, stretching from France to Poland, a no-man's land of enemy airfields. At the center of the room stood General Ira C. Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force. His face was carved with fatigue, but his voice carried conviction. He pointed to the map, to a city near the Rhine, and said, "We go deeper. We hit their fuel. We strangle their war," a young officer objected. "Sir, without long-range escorts, we'll lose half the bombers before they even reach the target." Eaker's answer was the same as it had always been. "Victory has a price. And if we stop now, we'll pay it tenfold later." But privately, he knew they couldn't keep bleeding like this. In hangars across England, pilots of the bomber groups prepared for their next missions. They were young, pale, and exhausted. Many had already survived too many flights. The lucky ones drank quietly the night before, not to celebrate, but to forget. And then there were the fighter boys, the Thunderbolt squadrons of the 56th. 78th and 353rd Fighter Groups. They were restless, frustrated, hungry to fight. Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th, had seen too many bomber formations vanish over Germany. He was convinced the key wasn't bravery. It was reach. "We need to stay with them all the way," he told his men. "Otherwise, the bombers are nothing but targets." But the math didn't work. The P-47's massive engine drank fuel like a thirsty giant. With current tanks, it couldn't stay airborne long enough to follow the bombers past the Ruhr. Every pilot knew that when the call came, little friends were turning back. It meant the bombers were flying into hell alone. Across the Channel, in occupied France, the Luftwaffe waited. The Germans had turned air combat into an exact science. Their radar network, the Kammhuber line, could detect Allied formations long before they crossed the coast. From Lille to Hanover, waves of fighters stood ready, Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs, FW-190As, sleek, angular machines, armed with 20mm cannons and guided by men with nerves of ice at their head were veterans, who'd been flying since the Blitzkrieg, men who'd tasted victory when the world still trembled at the mention of the Luftwaffe. One of them was Major Walter Dahl, a tall, sharp-featured pilot with a record already glittering with kills. He'd survived Russia, fought over France, and watched friends burn alive at 20,000 feet. He'd seen the tide of war shift, but still believed the Reich could endure. To him, the American bombers were flying arrogance, slow-moving giants that believed their armor could shield them from reality. And the new American fighter? That was a joke. A big, clumsy beast that burned its fuel and lumbered across the sky like a whale trying to dance. Dahl and his men laughed when they saw the Thunderbolt for the first time. A fat pig, one said. If it turns, it dies. They didn't know that this pig was about to start hunting wolves. Back in England, the transformation was underway. Engineers at Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, were pushing the Thunderbolt's design to its limits. They added external fuel tanks, tweaked the supercharger, improved the canopy. Each change bought the pilots a little more range, a little more control, a little more power. Pilots, too, were evolving. Their tactics grew sharper, their discipline harder. Zemke drilled his men until formation flying became muscle memory. You live together, you fight together, he told them. If you go alone, you die alone. They practiced dive attacks, slashing maneuvers, boom and zoom engagements, using the P-47's enormous weight as both hammer and shield. The Germans wanted turning fights. The Americans refused. Instead, they struck fast, hit hard, and vanished back into the clouds. It wasn't elegant, but it was devastating. And slowly, painfully, the balance began to shift. The Germans were watching. Luftwaffe intelligence officers began to notice patterns. Their pilots were reporting engagements that ended faster, deadlier than before. American fighters seemed to dive faster, fire longer, and absorb more damage. Even more troubling, the number of Thunderbolts in the air was growing. What had once been a nuisance was now a storm. But the Germans had faith in their machines, their training, and their leaders. And above all, in their belief that Germany could not lose. By early 1944, that faith was beginning to crack. The Allied bombing campaign had started to reach the Ruhr, the beating heart of German industry. Cities like Essen, Cologne, and Düsseldorf burned night after night. Trains stopped running on schedule. Fuel shortages grew worse. And though the propaganda machine blared promises of vengeance and victory, the skies told a different story. The Luftwaffe was beginning to lose its grip. There's a strange thing about air war. It happens in silence for those on the ground. You can hear the engines, see the contrails, maybe watch a dogfight unfold like a deadly ballet high above. But you can't hear the bullets. The radio calls, the screaming metal. From below, it's all beauty and terror mingled together. In the villages of northern France, farmers looked up from their fields and saw white trails looping and crossing in the sky. Sometimes a black speck would spiral downward, a burning plane tumbling through the clouds like a falling star. They didn't know whether it was friend or foe. They only knew that someone was dying up there. In England, families gathered near airfields to watch squadrons take off. Mothers waved at the silver birds disappearing into the clouds, knowing that some would never come back. Children pressed their ears to the ground after takeoff, feeling the thunder in their bones. And in Germany, in cities bombed night after night, people huddled in cellars, praying that the next bomb wouldn't find their street. The war in the sky had come home to them, and it was merciless. The 8th Air Force was growing bolder. Under new leadership, General Jimmy Doolittle, the same man who'd led the daring raid on Tokyo 2 years earlier. The American strategy shifted. Doolittle understood that the Luftwaffe couldn't be beaten by bombs alone. It had to be destroyed in the air. His order was simple and brutal. The first mission of our fighter planes is to destroy German fighters. No more strict escort patterns. No more waiting for bombers to be attacked. The fighters would go on the hunt. And the P-47 was built for the hunt. The pilots loved Doolittle for that. It gave them freedom. The freedom to strike, to take initiative, to fight back on their own terms. And as 1944 dawned, the jug began to show its fangs. Still, to the Germans, the arrogance of the Americans was infuriating. Do they think they can fly over our homeland unpunished? Walter Dahl wrote in his journal, "Every kilometer of our sky is watched. Every attack will be answered." But his words carried an undertone of fear. Fuel was growing scarce. New pilots were arriving barely half-trained. The elite units that had once ruled the skies, JG-26, JG-2, JG-1, were now filled with boys barely out of school, flying against enemies with endless supplies and growing skill. In mess halls across occupied Europe, Luftwaffe officers still clinked glasses and laughed, but the laughter was brittle. They toasted to victories that were getting smaller, to friends who weren't coming back. And outside, the distant hum of engines was growing louder, the sound of the future coming from the west. In March 1944, the P-47's reach finally extended deep into Germany. New external tanks gave it the range it needed. The pilots of Zemke's Wolfpack, as the 56th Fighter Group was now called, were unleashed. They struck at airfields, trains, and columns on the ground. They strafed anything that moved: trucks, locomotives, even horse-drawn supply wagons. The Germans had laughed at the jug. Now they dove for cover whenever its shadow passed overhead. For the first time, the Luftwaffe wasn't just being fought. It was being hunted. Hub Zemke watched it happen with cold satisfaction. He'd lost men, good men, but he could see the tide turning. In every mission debrief, his pilots spoke with the same grim pride. "Sir, the Jerrys don't stick around anymore. They're breaking earlier. You can feel it. They know we're coming." But Zemke was no fool. He knew war wasn't a straight line, and he knew that when you cornered an enemy like the Luftwaffe, they didn't fade quietly. They fought harder, meaner, more desperate than ever. He told his men to stay sharp. "When the Germans start running," he said, "that's when they're most dangerous." He was right. By April, the bombers were returning from missions with fewer holes. The Luftwaffe's attacks were smaller, their coordination weaker. But the price was still high. For every Thunderbolt that made it home, another was missing, last seen diving into the clouds or trailing smoke across the channel. In one such mission, near Bremen, a young pilot named Lieutenant Robert Bob Johnson found himself surrounded by FW-190s. His P-47 was riddled with cannon fire, his canopy shattered, his instrument panel on fire. But the jug refused to die. He kept flying, half-blind, back toward England. When he finally landed, mechanics counted 21 bullet holes in his cockpit alone. Johnson climbed out, shaken but alive. He looked at the torn fuselage, the scorched wings, and said quietly, "She brought me home." Stories like that began to spread, and slowly, myth became morale. The P-47 wasn't just a fighter anymore. It was a symbol. A machine that refused to give up, an iron angel in the storm. But over Germany, the storm was only beginning. In the bunkers beneath Berlin, Luftwaffe command was facing an impossible equation. They were losing aircraft faster than they could replace them. The Allied bombing campaign was tearing apart the production chain. Fuel was scarce. Training time had been slashed from months to weeks. Yet the order from Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, never changed. Defend the Reich at all costs. Pilots obeyed. They climbed into their fighters, knowing the odds were against them. They took off with engines sputtering, instruments failing, but they flew anyway, because they had no choice. One young German pilot, barely 20, wrote in his diary, "We know we are losing, but every time we see those silver planes in our skies, we have to fight. It's all we have left, the fight." He never came home from his next mission. The stage was set. The Luftwaffe, once the master of the skies, was beginning to fracture under the relentless weight of Allied production and American willpower. The P-47 had proven itself not just as a fighter, but as a statement that America's industrial muscle and its pilots' courage could match and even surpass the elite of Germany. But even as the Germans' control over the air slipped, they had one last weapon, a new generation of aircraft that would push the limits of what the human eye and nerve could handle. Whispers spread among the Allied pilots, something faster, something new, something jet-powered, and soon the Thunderbolt would meet it, head-on, in the deadliest, most chaotic months of the air war. The laughter had stopped, but the reckoning had only begun. And when the sky over Normandy turned black with planes, the world would learn what true thunder sounded like. The hunters become the hunted. The morning mist hung over the airfield like a shroud. Dew clung to the wings of the Focke-Wulf 190s lined. Up on the tarmac, their black crosses glistening faintly in the weak sun. From a distance they looked like predators at rest, sleek, patient, silent. But the men who would fly them no longer felt like hunters. They felt like survivors. It was February 1944, and the war in the air had changed. For years, these same men of the Jagdflieger, the fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe, had been gods of the sky. They'd carved their reputations in the air above France and Russia, dueling with Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Yakovlevs. They'd watched enemies fall in flames and returned to base with victory tallies painted under their canopies. Now, their kills meant less. Their victories came slower, and every mission felt like gambling with death. Inside a mess hall near Le Culot Air Base, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sour tang of fatigue. Pilots huddled around wooden tables, mugs of ersatz coffee between their hands. On the wall hung a chalkboard with sortie assignments. Beneath the names, someone had scrawled a line of gallows humor. Wer heute fliegt, stirbt morgen. He who flies today dies tomorrow. No one laughed. At the end of the table sat Hauptmann Günther Rall, commander of the 2nd, JG-11, a veteran with over 200 kills, one of the Luftwaffe's golden boys. He was still only 25, yet his face looked a decade older. He read the board silently, then folded his arms, as if holding himself together. Across from him, a new recruit, barely 19, cheeks still soft with youth, asked nervously, "Herr Hauptmann, is it true the Americans have a new fighter, the one with the 8 guns?" Rall looked up, his eyes cold and distant. "Yes," he said. "It's called the Thunderbolt, big as a house, but it flies faster than it should, and it dives like the devil. Don't let it get above you, ever." The room went quiet. Another pilot, older, grinning through exhaustion, tried to lighten the mood. "I hear if you shoot it, the bullets bounce off." Someone snorted. Someone else said, "Then shoot it twice." But even that thin humor carried a trace of fear. For all their pride, the Luftwaffe pilots could feel it, the tide turning. Their aircraft, once the cutting edge of engineering, were now meeting swarms of American machines built in numbers they couldn't comprehend. Where once a formation of B-17s had been a challenge, now hundreds filled the sky, escorted by fighters that refused to leave. And those fighters, the Thunderbolts, didn't fight fair. They came from the sun, from above, from impossible angles. They dove faster, hit harder, and vanished before anyone could react. The German pilots called them Rauchschwalben, smoke swallows, because they appeared out of nowhere, left trails of death, and disappeared into the clouds. The arrogance that had fueled the Luftwaffe's glory years was crumbling under the weight of exhaustion. Each mission cost fuel they couldn't afford, pilots they couldn't replace, and faith they could no longer fake. But in the halls of command, faith was demanded, not requested. In Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring still strutted in his tailored uniforms, festooned with medals. He assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe remained unbeatable, that the American bombing campaign was a temporary nuisance. He spoke of new weapons, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the jet fighter that would turn the tide, the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, the guided V-weapons that would bring Britain to its knees. To Göring, the Luftwaffe's struggle was not failure, it was destiny delayed. But in the field, the truth was clearer. The invincible Luftwaffe was slowly bleeding to death. At Jagerschwader 26, the legendary Schlageter wing, Oberst Joseph Pips Priller watched as his pilots took off one by one. He'd been flying since the Battle of France. Back then, victory had felt inevitable. The Reich had seemed eternal. Now, as he stood in the chill air, watching his men vanish into the morning haze, he knew how fragile eternity really was. Fuel shortages were crippling operations. Each sortie had to be justified. Training time for recruits had dropped from 250 hours to less than 100. Some barely knew how to land their aircraft before being sent to the front. The sky that had once belonged to the Eagles now belonged to the storm. In contrast, the Americans were learning, fast. Every engagement taught them something new: how to counter head-on attacks, how to climb faster, how to coordinate strikes. Their tactics evolved with machine-like precision, shared across squadrons in days. The Luftwaffe pilots couldn't keep up. Each battle felt like fighting ghosts that grew stronger every time you saw them. And yet pride refused to die. Even as their world narrowed, fuel, men, and hope slipping away, the Jagdflieger clung to the one thing they still had: skill. They were still some of the best pilots ever trained. Their reflexes were honed to razor edges. Their instincts were born from years of survival. And when they met the Thunderbolts in the air, they still believed deep down that they could win. A mission over the Ruhr. March 1944. A formation of B-17s droned eastward, their silver bellies glinting in the pale sun. Above them, Thunderbolts cruised in lazy arcs, protective, watchful, predatory. From the north came the Germans. 20 FW-190s, climbing hard, led by Major Walter Dahl. Dahl's voice crackled over the radio. 10 Uhr, Angriff. 10 o'clock, attack. The German formation dove in. Cannon fire lit the air. The first bursts tore through a B-17's wing, and the giant tumbled into smoke. Cheers erupted in the German radios. Then from nowhere came the reply, a roar like rolling thunder. The Thunderbolts dropped from above, guns blazing. Dahl pulled hard on the stick, but the sky was full of tracers. He saw one of his pilots explode, the cockpit consumed in flame. Another was spinning out of control, wings sheared. He broke right, dove, and for the first time in his career, felt the icy fingers of panic. The Americans weren't reacting anymore. They were hunting. Back on the ground, after the mission, Dahl sat on a wooden crate beside his aircraft. Staring at nothing, his mechanic approached, hesitant. "How many did we lose, Herr Major?" Dahl didn't answer. He just shook his head. Somewhere in the distance, a P-47's engine could be heard, faint but distinct. The mechanic muttered, "They never stop coming." Dahl looked up at the sky, his voice low. "They can afford not to stop." By May, even the most optimistic Luftwaffe officers knew the truth. The Americans were winning the air war, not by brilliance, not even by luck, but by relentless endurance. For every Thunderbolt shot down, 2 more arrived the next week. For every German ace killed, his replacement was a boy with trembling hands and barely an hour's gunnery practice. And for every factory bombed, another German city lost its heartbeat. Still, the Germans refused to surrender the sky. They flew on, driven by pride, loyalty, and a grim sense of duty. Many Luftwaffe pilots began to see themselves not as soldiers of the Reich, but as brothers defending one another against impossible odds. They painted symbols of defiance on their planes: skulls, shields, swords, wolves. They knew they were doomed, but they would not go quietly. One ace, Erich Rudorfer, reportedly said after his 200th kill, It means nothing now. Every time I take off, I lose another friend. That was the new face of the Luftwaffe. Men haunted by survival. And yet, there was one thing that gave them hope. One whisper that spread through airfields from France to the Ruhr. Through hangars lit by lanterns and the smell of oil and fear. The jet, the Messerschmitt Me-262. A machine so fast, so powerful, that it promised to change everything. Powered by two Junkers Jumo 04 turbojets, capable of speeds over 500 miles per hour, faster than any propeller-driven fighter in the world. Goering called it the wonder weapon. Hitler called it the revenge of the Reich. The pilots called it their last chance. They dreamed of squadrons of jets streaking across the sky, cutting down bombers by the dozen, restoring balance, restoring pride. But for now, it was still a prototype, fragile and few. And while they dreamed, the Thunderbolts kept coming. Summer 1944. The invasion of Normandy was approaching, though the Germans didn't yet know when or where. But they could feel it. The intensity of Allied air raids had become unbearable. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was an occupation. Every day, Thunderbolts swept across France in waves, strafing trains, convoys, depots. The Luftwaffe could barely get airborne before being ambushed. One pilot described it in his diary. "We used to hunt. Now we hide." The Americans owned the daylight. At Saint-André-de-l'Eure, a Luftwaffe field outside Paris, a young pilot named Lieutenant Klaus Becker climbed into his FW-190 for what would be his fourth mission that week. His hands shook as he adjusted the throttle. He had 50 hours of flight experience, total. His instructor had been killed 2 days earlier. As he rolled down the runway, he saw the streak of sunlight flash across the sky. Contrails. Dozens of them, heading west to east. He was still climbing when they came. Thunderbolts swooping low, their 8 Brownings blazing. The airfield exploded in chaos. Planes burned, fuel trucks erupted, and Becker's wingman vanished in a fireball. Becker dove for the tree line, heart pounding. He never saw the P-47 that found him from behind. When they recovered his body, his aircraft was a crater. His flight log was open to the last line he ever wrote. "The sky belongs to them." The psychological toll was immense. German pilots began to dread the sound, that deep, rhythmic thunder of the P-47's radial engine. It was a sound that meant death was near, even if you couldn't see it. They used to laugh when they heard it. Now they flinched. They called it der Donner des Todes, the thunder of death. Even civilians came to recognize it. Farmers froze in their fields when the sound approached. Children hid. The massive fighter's silhouette, broad wings, round fuselage. The glint of its guns became a symbol of inevitability. The hunter had become the hunted. Still, amid the collapse, fragments of the old pride remained. Men like Walter Dahl, Gunther Rahl, and Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace of all time, continued to fight, to kill, to survive. But each knew the truth. They were fighting ghosts. One by one, the aces fell, not just to enemy fire, but to exhaustion, despair, and the slow realization that no skill could outfly numbers. No courage could outlast machinery. The Jagdwaffe had lived by the creed of mastery. Now it was dying by the weight of history. In July 1944, as the Allies prepared to break out of Normandy, Walter Dahl wrote in his diary, "I used to believe the sky belonged to us. That belief kept me alive, but the sky does not belong to men anymore. It belongs to machines, and to those who build more of them." He closed the book, lit a cigarette, and watched another squadron of Thunderbolts pass overhead, contrails crossing like white scars across the sky. He didn't even reach for his helmet. He just watched, because deep down he knew the laughter had died for good, and the thunder was only getting louder. Next, that thunder would fall upon the earth itself, turning Europe's fields and roads into hellfire. The day the sky fell dawn over Normandy came grey and heavy, the kind of dawn that smells of rain and cordite. The sea was invisible beneath a quilt of fog, but you could hear it breathing, that slow, endless rhythm against the cliffs. On the horizon, something else stirred, a low hum, then a growl, then the mounting roar of 1,000 engines rising together. The invasion had begun. June 6, 1944. D-Day. To the men huddled on landing craft below, the sky sounded alive and alive with thunder. And above that endless armada of ships and soldiers came the wings of protection, the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force, already darkening the sky. They came in from England like storm clouds, silver and grey and streaked with the black soot of exhaust. Beneath their wings hung bombs and rockets. In their bellies, 8 50-caliber guns waited impatiently for work. The pilots could see the French coastline through holes in the fog. It looked calm from up here, deceptively calm, the green fields of Normandy still dotted with farmhouses and hedgerows. But they knew what waited below, bunkers, guns, and the most fortified beaches in the world. Their mission was simple: make sure the enemy never lifts his head long enough to fight back. As the first wave of paratroopers fell through the clouds, the Thunderbolts roared overhead in perfect formation. The pilots could see the tiny white parachutes drifting toward the fields, men dangling beneath like fragile seeds. Every instinct told them to protect those falling figures at all costs. And then, out of the mist, the coast appeared, Omaha Beach, dotted with fire. Tracer rounds shot up from the bunkers, red threads stitching the sky. The Thunderbolts broke formation and dove, screaming down toward the German defenses. The roar of their engines merged with the explosion of rockets. From above, it looked like the world was being erased. From below, it sounded like Judgment Day. German gunners tried to fight back, but their shells burst far behind the diving fighters. The P-47s hit and climbed, hit again, over and over, until the concrete bunkers cracked like eggs. The radio chatter was a symphony of chaos. "Target 1, gone! 2 down, smoke rising. Watch flak at 11. Each voice carried adrenaline and fear, but also something else, a fierce belief that they were making history, one explosion at a time. Down below, the German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division had never seen anything like it. One soldier wrote later, "The air was alive. You could not breathe without swallowing fire. The planes came like wasps, shooting, bombing, never stopping. We could not look up. To look up was to die." For years, the Wehrmacht had been the masters of shock and awe. Now they were the ones being crushed beneath it. The once mocked Thunderbolt, the flying brick, was no longer a joke. It was the hammer of the gods, smashing through tanks, trains, and men alike. The 509th Squadron flew in low, barely 50 feet above the hedgerows. From that height, the French countryside blurred into streaks of green and brown. The smell of gunpowder filled their cockpits. Every time they fired, the aircraft shuddered like it was alive. T. Draymond Knight banked hard, sighted a German column retreating along a dirt road, and squeezed the trigger. The 8 Brownings lit up, spitting streams of red tracers. Trucks erupted. Soldiers scattered. The Thunderbolt screamed overhead like a banshee. In seconds, the road was a graveyard of burning steel. Knight pulled up sharply, canopy rattling, and looked down. He'd seen death before, but never like this. So close, so absolute. He swallowed hard and whispered, "Sorry, boys." Then he turned for another pass. By midday, the air above Normandy was a solid roar. The Thunderbolts were everywhere, so many that some soldiers on the ground thought there must be 10,000 of them. They strafed bridges, smashed communication lines, obliterated rail yards. They hunted anything with wheels. German armor tried to regroup, but the sky would not allow it. A tank commander of the 21st Panzer Division remembered, "We could not move by day. If an engine started, a plane came. It was like the sky had eyes." And indeed it did. The Thunderbolt's dive was a terrifying sight. From high altitude, it would roll inverted, nose down, and scream toward the earth at nearly 500 miles an hour. To the German soldiers below, the howl of its supercharger was the sound of doom. They called it Der Schrecken, the terror. Each dive was measured, almost surgical. The pilots had learned to spot movement on the ground the way a hawk sees a rabbit. A truck convoy here, a locomotive there, a glint of armor under the trees. They'd swoop, fire, and vanish before anyone could return fire. By afternoon, the Allied beachhead was secure, but the work was far from over. Behind the beaches, the Wehrmacht was gathering strength for a counterattack. If they could push the Allies back into the sea within 48 hours, the invasion could still fail. The task of stopping that counterattack fell largely to the sky. June 7th. The weather broke. Rain poured over the Norman countryside, but the Thunderbolts flew anyway. Mud or not, cloud or not, they flew. They bombed roads, rail junctions, anything that moved. Sometimes they flew so low that tree branches scraped their wings. At Villers-Bocage, a German armored column tried to slip through the hedgerows toward the front. Leading it were the feared Tiger tanks, monsters of steel that could destroy a Sherman from 2 miles away, but they never got the chance. A flight of P-47s, guided by spotters on the ground, fell upon them like thunderbolts from heaven. Rockets streaked in. Tanks exploded. The fields burned. Survivors ran for cover, but the jugs turned, strafing them in relentless arcs. When it was over, the road was a smoking ruin. Dozens of tanks lay gutted and blackened. The German counterattack was gone before it began. The Allied infantry, watching from the hedgerows, cheered. One soldier shouted, "Give 'em hell, boys!" The pilots didn't hear him. Their radios were filled with static and heartbeats, but they didn't need to. They knew, even German aces began to admit it, the sky was lost. Major Roll, recovering from wounds, later wrote, "You could not fight them anymore. Not because we were afraid, but because there were too many. The sky belonged to the Americans, and the Thunderbolt was their hammer." Still, some refused to quit. Squadrons of FW-190s and BF-109s scrambled to intercept the Allied fleets, but they were shredded by the new reality. In one engagement near Argentan, a group of 9 Thunderbolts tangled with nearly 30 German fighters. They shot down 12 without losing a single man. The air war had flipped completely. On the ground, the French resistance called the P-47s Les Anges de Fer, the Iron Angels. Farmers who had hidden from the Luftwaffe now waved as the jugs passed overhead, their engines rattling windows and hearts alike. The pilots sometimes dipped their wings in return, a silent promise that liberation was coming. But liberation came at a cost. Even the invincible Thunderbolt was not immortal. Flak guns lined every road, and the black clouds of 88mm shells hung like malignant flowers in the sky. Every day planes went down. Some hit by flak, some by accident, some by sheer bad luck. Joseph Bale's Thunderbolt was hit near St. Lo. He bailed out, was captured by the Germans, escaped, and later fought alongside a Soviet tank unit, the only American known to have done so. His story was one of hundreds that blurred the line between legend and survival. The Thunderbolt's legend grew not from speed or grace, but from resilience. A Spitfire could dance. A Mustang could run. But a Thunderbolt could endure. Pilots joked that you could shoot one full of holes, cut off an entire cylinder, and it would still fly home. And they weren't wrong. The plane's radial engine could keep spinning even when half destroyed. Many pilots returned with wings shredded, tails ripped, oil leaking, and still landed safely. Each landing was a miracle written in oil and smoke, and each one deepened the myth. In the chaos of the breakout from Normandy, the Thunderbolt found its true identity. It was no longer just a fighter. It was a flying artillery piece, a weapon of ground annihilation. When the Allies broke through at St. Lo in July, the jugs were there, roaring overhead, blasting German strongpoints, shredding armored columns trying to retreat. One German officer described the scene to a war correspondent after the war. "We were not defeated by tanks or men. We were defeated by the planes. You could not fight when the sky itself wanted you dead." By August, the Thunderbolt's roar was constant. It became the daily sound of liberation and of destruction. The Luftwaffe tried one last stand, Operation Bodenplatte, the New Year's Day 1945 assault on Allied airfields. Hundreds of German fighters attacked in a desperate bid to destroy the Allied air force on the ground. They achieved surprise for a few hours. Then the Thunderbolts rose. The air turned into a cage of fire. The Germans destroyed some planes, yes, but they paid a price they couldn't afford. Nearly 300 German aircraft were lost in a single day. It was the Luftwaffe's last breath. From then on, the Thunderbolt owned the daylight. In those final months, the P-47s ranged freely across a dying Reich. They bombed bridges on the Rhine, strafed trains fleeing east, and blasted convoys retreating from the Western Front. In one mission over the Remagen Bridge, Thunderbolts dove again and again to protect the fragile Allied crossing from counterattack. Their pilots came back hoarse from shouting, exhausted, but alive. By now, even the German civilians who once jeered the bombers from the safety of their towns no longer looked up. The sound of engines meant only one thing. The war was over for whoever stood beneath. The men who flew the P-47 knew they were witnessing the death of an empire, not from speeches or armies, but from power. Every time they pressed the trigger, every time those 8 guns roared, they were tearing apart the myth of Nazi invincibility. Yet in quiet moments, they felt the weight of it. After missions, in tents lit by bare bulbs, they'd sit on their bunks and stare at their hands still shaking, still smelling of cordite. Some couldn't sleep, some couldn't stop smiling. Most couldn't tell the difference anymore. Hub Zemke, the Wolfpack's leader, once said to his men, "You don't have to like it. You just have to finish it." And finish it they did. By the fall of 1944, the Thunderbolt had become the most feared weapon in Western Europe. It had destroyed thousands of enemy planes, tens of thousands of vehicles, and rewritten the rules of air power. The German pilots, who once called it the Flying Brick, now had a new name for it: Der Sensenmann, the Grim Reaper. And by the time the snows came, the reaping was nearly done. But war never ends cleanly. Every victory has a price, and every pilot who landed safely knew someone who hadn't. When they climbed from their cockpits, sweat freezing on their faces, the adrenaline draining from their veins, they sometimes caught each other's eyes and saw the same thing, a flicker of disbelief that they were still alive. The laughter came back then, quiet and hollow, not mocking anymore, but human. The Germans had once laughed at them. Now the Americans laughed too, but only to keep from crying, because beneath the glory, beneath the thunder, lay the truth of every war. Nobody wins without losing a piece of their soul. And for the Thunderbolt pilots, that reckoning was still to come. The skies had been conquered. Now the ground would remember. Wings of fire and shadows. The sky was theirs now, but it didn't feel like victory. By the winter of 1944, the Thunderbolt ruled the daylight over Europe. The Luftwaffe was broken, its remnants scattering like ash before the wind. The Germans still fought, but the pride was gone. The skies that had once carried their banners now carried their defeat. Yet for the men flying the P-47s, the roar of the engine was no longer the sound of triumph. It was a heartbeat that never slowed, a pulse of exhaustion, grief, and grim necessity. They'd become the angels of death, and angels, they were learning, don't sleep. Snow blanketed the airfields in Belgium and northern France. The hangars smelled of oil, sweat, and loneliness. Ground crews shuffled through the slush, wrapping scarves around their faces, refueling the big jugs for yet another mission into the cold heart of the Reich. Inside a briefing tent at Asch Airfield, Colonel Hub Zemke stood before his men. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice rough from too many cigarettes and not enough rest. On the wall behind him, a map of Western Germany bristled with pins, bridges, rail junctions, convoys. "Fuels their blood," he said, pointing at the red circles. "We cut it off. The beast dies faster." He didn't have to remind them that every sortie meant flak. Every bridge they hit was guarded by an invisible web of German anti-aircraft guns. Still, they nodded. Still, they flew. Out on the runway, the Thunderbolts idled, coughing plumes of white exhaust into the cold air. The pilots climbed aboard, their breath fogging inside the canopies. Each one carried a photograph, a wife, a girl, a dog, a baby, tucked somewhere within reach. St. Francis Gabby Gabreski ran his hand along the fuselage of his P-47D HVA, the machine that had made him a legend. 73 combat missions, 28 kills. He knew the numbers didn't matter anymore. Only the next takeoff, the next landing. He smiled to his crew chief, a weary kid from Detroit with oil permanently under his fingernails. "Keep her warm for me, Jimmy. I'll bring her back with a few less holes than last time." Jimmy grinned. "You always say that." "Sir," Gabreski climbed in, adjusted his gloves, and whispered under his breath, "Let's go to work." They took off into the gray sky, the snow whipping across the wings like smoke. Below them, the war had turned white, towns buried in frost, rivers frozen, forests skeletal. But the cold did nothing to soften the brutality. The German army, cornered but not broken, was fighting like a wounded animal. And then came December 16th, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the last great gamble of the Third Reich. At dawn, German artillery roared to life along a 70-mile front. The Ardennes exploded in thunder and flame. In the confusion, weather closed in, fog so thick you could barely see your wingtips. For days, the skies were grounded. The Thunderbolts sat useless, their engines silent, their pilots pacing like caged beasts. They could hear the reports coming in. American units surrounded, towns overrun, fuel depots captured. The Germans were rolling again, their panzers cutting through the mist. Zemke's men begged to fly. "Sir, we can't just sit here." "I know," he said quietly. "But right now, the sky belongs to the weather." Then, on December 23rd, the clouds finally broke. The world below revealed itself in horror. Black columns of smoke, shattered armor, bodies in the snow. The order came down from Doolittle himself. Get everything that flies into the air. And so they did. Hundreds of thunderbolts roared into the clearing sky. The Germans never stood a chance. The panzers that had once rolled unchallenged through the Ardennes now found themselves under constant attack. Convoys burned. Bridges collapsed. Entire divisions were pinned down by the relentless hammering from above. One pilot described it later. "We weren't flying missions. We were swatting nightmares." The sky was clear and cruel, and everything that moved on the ground died. For 3 days, the Thunderbolts hunted. At Bastogne, at St. Vith, at Malmedy, they came in wave after wave. The German soldiers who survived spoke of it in whispers afterward. The way the sound came first, low and distant, then the shadow, then the screaming fire. Even hardened SS tank crews panicked when they heard that deep, throaty growl. The P-47 had become a psychological weapon. Its very presence enough to break morale. But to the pilots, it was personal. They saw American soldiers surrounded, fighting in the snow, waving at the sky for help. They answered. They dove until their gun barrels glowed red, until their vision blurred, until the flak turned the clouds into black fire. And when they climbed back into the sunlight, they could see it, the tide turning again. The bulge was closing. The enemy was breaking. On Christmas morning, the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group gathered for coffee and silence. Outside, the air was bitter cold, but the horizon was bright. Someone had hung a small wreath on the propeller of a grounded P-47. Someone else had chalked the words, "Merry Christmas," Jerry on a bomb casing. They laughed, but quietly. They'd lost too many friends to laugh loudly anymore. Zemke looked at the men who were still alive. "You've done your part," he said simply. "You gave them a Christmas they'll never forget." No one cheered. They just nodded and went back to their planes. That winter marked the final transformation of the Thunderbolt. It was no longer merely an aircraft. It was an instrument of inevitability. Every bridge they bombed, every train they tore apart, every convoy they erased, it all pointed to one truth: Germany was finished. But even as they won the sky, the pilots began to feel something they hadn't felt before. Guilt. The first time you shoot down an enemy, you feel triumph. The 10th time, you feel pride. The 100th time, you just feel tired. Gabreski once wrote in his diary, "I used to think of them as targets. Now I wonder if they were fathers too." He never stopped flying, but he stopped smiling afterward. In January 1945, Gabreski's war came to an abrupt pause. After 166 missions, his luck ran out. While strafing a German airfield near Koblenz, his plane clipped the ground and broke apart. He survived, but was captured. When German soldiers pulled him from the wreckage, one of them looked at the Thunderbolt's shattered fuselage and muttered, "So this is the monster that's been killing us." Gabreski, bruised and bleeding, simply said, "You got one. Congratulations." He spent the rest of the war in a POW camp and lived to see the end. Others weren't so lucky. Oscar Perdomo, the last American ace of the war, would make his final kills on the very last day of combat in 1945, and then disappear into the quiet of civilian life, never quite finding peace again. Some pilots drank too much when they came home. Some never came home at all, and the planes, those magnificent, ugly, unstoppable machines, were scrapped by the thousands once peace arrived. The jugs that had carried their pilots through hell were left to rust, their engines silent, their wings clipped. The men who had once laughed inside them felt an ache that no medal could ease. Meanwhile, on the other side of the war, the Luftwaffe's remnants lay in ruin. The once proud aces who'd mocked the flying brick now walked through fields littered with their own wreckage. Walter Dahl saw the end coming and wrote bitterly in his journal, "We began this war as knights. We ended as ghosts." The Me-262 jets did appear, streaking across the sky like silver phantoms, faster than anything else in the air, but too late. There was no fuel, no pilots, no hope left to use them. When a handful of Thunderbolts finally engaged the jets over Munich, it was not a duel of equals, it was a requiem. The jets were faster, yes, but the jugs were everywhere. One by one the German pilots fell. The laughter was gone from both sides now. All that remained was endurance. By spring, the war was collapsing like a dying storm. April 1945. The Rhine had been crossed and Allied forces were sweeping through Germany. The Thunderbolts flew their last missions, not against enemies, but against remnants. Sometimes there was nothing left to shoot at. The skies were empty. One pilot described it in his logbook. "We flew over a Germany that looked like the moon. Everything black, everything burning. The war was ending, but the noise in our heads wasn't. They'd won the air war so completely that it felt meaningless. When the news finally came, Hitler dead. Berlin fallen, Germany surrendered. The airfields erupted in celebration. Men hugged. Some wept. Some simply stood staring at the ground, as if the earth itself might crumble if they let go of the moment. Hub Zemke gathered his squadron one last time. "You did your duty," he told them. "Now go home." "The sky doesn't need you anymore," they cheered. But not loudly. The sky was quiet again. In the days that followed, the Thunderbolts sat lined up wingtip to wingtip, their paint scorched, their guns empty. The mechanics wiped them down one last time. The pilots packed their bags, folded their maps, and tried to remember how to live without the roar. One of them carved a small message into the concrete near his plane's parking spot. "She got me home." It's still there today, half erased by time, but the legacy of those wings of fire and shadows, lived on. The P-47 had flown over 746,000 sorties in Europe alone. It had destroyed more than 6,000 enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands on the ground. It had proven that in war, strength was not in elegance or speed, but in resilience, the will to take a hit and keep flying. It was the iron heart of a new kind of warfare, relentless, industrial, unstoppable. And yet, behind every statistic was a man, 20 years old, terrified, brave, and unbearably human, whispering into his oxygen mask, "Please, just one more landing." As the war ended, the pilots scattered back into the world. Some became farmers, teachers, engineers. Some joined new wars in Korea. Some never stopped flying. But every one of them remembered the feel of the throttle under their hand, the sound of the wind tearing past the canopy, and the moment, that fleeting moment, when life and death were separated only by the thickness of a bullet's shell. They'd lived inside the thunder, and the thunder never left them. And yet, even after the fires went out, the question lingered, the one no after-action report could answer. After so much power, after so much destruction, what does a man do when the sky goes silent? The answer would come in time, But first, the world had to look at what the thunder had left behind and learn what it truly cost. Echoes of thunder. The war ended with silence. After 6 years of noise, engines, explosions, sirens, gunfire, the quiet was almost unbearable. It lay heavy over Europe like the morning fog after a storm, settling into every crater, every ruin, every empty field where once the earth had shaken. The skies that had been crowded with wings were suddenly empty. No contrails, no shadows, no distant growl of Pratt & Whitney or Daimler-Benz, only wind and memory. At airfields across England and France, the Thunderbolts stood in long, solemn rows. Their wings drooped slightly, like tired soldiers at parade rest. Paint was scorched, canopies cracked, gun barrels stained with cordite that would never be cleaned again. Ground crews walked among them quietly, touching the machines they'd nursed through hell. For 2 years, these aircraft had been alive, roaring, trembling, spitting fire. Now they were relics. A few would be sold to other countries. Most would be scrapped, their aluminum melted down to make pots, cars, perhaps even the girders of new cities. The men who had loved them didn't watch when the torches came out. You don't watch a friend die twice. The pilots went home in waves. They boarded ships and trains, duffel bags slung over their shoulders, uniforms stiff with salt and sun. In New York, Boston, San Francisco, crowds met them with cheers and brass bands. But the noise on the docks was not the same as the thunder they'd known. For some, the silence that followed was worse than the danger. They'd lived at full throttle, hearts synced to the rhythm of a 2,000 horsepower engine. How do you come back from that? Hub Zemka stepped off a transport ship in April 1945 and looked around at a world already moving on. Factories that once made fighters now made refrigerators. Posters that had called for victory now advertised nylon stockings. He smiled politely for the photographers, then disappeared into civilian life. He rarely spoke of the war, but years later, when asked what he remembered most, he said quietly, "The sound. You never forget that sound. It's still up there somewhere in the clouds." Francis Gaby Gabreski came home thin and pale from captivity. His family barely recognized him at first. He married, raised children, and kept flying, first in peacetime, then in Korea, where the jets had replaced the old propellers. But he never stopped calling the P-47 my girl. When younger pilots asked him what it was like, he'd grin and say, "Like holding the hand of God and hoping he doesn't let go." Then he'd go quiet for a while. In the small towns scattered across America, the war left its traces in quieter ways. An empty chair at the dinner table, a photograph on a mantelpiece showing a smiling boy in a leather jacket, goggles around his neck. An engine cowling turned into a mailbox. A story told over and over until it became legend. The women who had built the Thunderbolts in New York, Evansville and Farmingdale, the riveters and machinists, went back to families, to kitchens, to normal life. Yet they too remembered the noise. The rhythmic pounding of the assembly lines had sounded like drums of victory back then. Now it was memory, echoing in their hands. In Germany, the silence was different. It was the silence of defeat. The Luftwaffe's airfields were graveyards, twisted metal, burned-out fuselages, bullet-scarred hangars. The proud eagles of the Reich were grounded forever. Men like Walter Dahl and Günter Rahl survived, though barely. They returned to find their homeland in ruins, their cities rubble, their families scattered. Some refused to fly again. Others, paradoxically, built the new Luftwaffe of post-war West Germany, serving in NATO alongside the very nations they had once fought. Rahl, who would one day shake hands with the American pilots who had hunted him, said in an interview years later, "We were enemies because history said so. But the sky doesn't keep grudges. Europe rebuilt itself from ashes." Railroads repaired, cities rose again, children learned to laugh without flinching at thunder. But the landscape bore scars no architect could erase. Lines of bomb craters turned into ponds, forests where twisted aluminum still glinted beneath the moss. In the hedgerows of Normandy, farmers plowed up bullets and bits of engine cowling every spring. Some kept them, some threw them away. The earth never forgot, and sometimes On a still evening, when the wind was just right, it seemed to carry an echo, a low, distant hum, like the ghost of a thunderbolt passing overhead. For the men who'd flown them, peace was both blessing and burden. They'd seen the worst the world could make, and they'd survived it, but survival demanded its own kind of courage. Nightmares came quietly, the flash of tracers, the smell of smoke, the faces of the ones who didn't come back. Some pilots found solace in flying again, this time for airlines that stitched the same Atlantic they'd once fought over. Others built lives on the ground, pretending they didn't miss the sky. A few, unable to bear the silence, bought small planes and flew alone on weekends, circling over fields just to hear the wind again. History moved on. Jets replaced propellers, missiles replaced machine guns, satellites replaced scouts. But the lessons of the Thunderbolt endured. Engineers studying combat reports realized that brute strength and survivability mattered as much as speed. Designers carried that truth into new aircraft. The F-84, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog. Ugly, tough, indestructible. A spiritual descendant of the Jug. Even the name lived on, because some kinds of thunder never fade. Museums began to collect the few surviving P-47s, polishing their metal skins until they gleamed again under the lights. Veterans would visit them, hands trembling, eyes misting. They'd run their fingers along the bullet holes preserved in the wings and whisper to their old friends, "She got me home. Good girl. Still a beauty, huh?" Sometimes a small child would tug at a sleeve and ask, "Did you really fly one of these?" The old pilot would nod and smile. Yes, a long time ago, when the sky was on fire. In the archives, historians tally the numbers: 746,000 sorties, 1.5 million tons of bombs dropped, thousands of bridges destroyed, more than 15,000 enemy vehicles burned, an airframe so tough that pilots joked it could bring them home on a prayer and a half-tank of fuel. But numbers cannot measure what it meant to those who lived it. The smell of hot oil, the rattle of 50 caliber guns, the taste of fear behind the oxygen mask, and the laughter. The laughter that began in mockery and ended in weary relief. Time, the most patient of all mechanics, polished away the anger. Decades later, American and German veterans would meet at reunions. Men who once tried to kill each other now shared beer and stories, trading memories instead of gunfire. They spoke of youth, of foolish courage, of comrades long gone. And when they mentioned the Thunderbolt, even the former enemies smiled. One Luftwaffe ace raised his glass and said, "We used to laugh at your flying beer barrel." An American answered, "Yeah?" She laughed last. They all laughed together then, softly, kindly, without malice. What remains, after the noise fades, is not the machines or the medals. It's the echo, the memory of men and women who faced the impossible and didn't flinch, the echo of engines that once shook the sky, now beating quietly in history's chest. The echo of courage that outlasts fear, the echo of thunder. Somewhere perhaps above the clouds of memory, there's still a squadron flying, eternal, untouchable, silver wings flashing in the sun. If you listen on a calm afternoon, you might hear them, a faint rumble in the distance, fading toward the horizon. And if you look up and smile, just once you'll know what they knew, that freedom, like flight, always begins with courage and ends with silence. Because every storm, no matter how loud, leaves behind an echo, and the echo of the P-47 Thunderbolt still rolls across the sky. The laughter stopped long ago. The thunder never did.